Hi everyone, so this week we're looking at mountains. So in order to prepare for this sermon, I looked at the different important events that happen up mountains. And when you start to think about it, there are loads. And the thing about different events that happen up mountains is that when they go off up a mountain somewhere, you can almost guarantee that there's going to be something spectacular happen. So if we think of a few examples, we have God testing Abraham by telling Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac. We have Moses going up a mountain to get the Ten Commandments. And we have Noah's Ark, which actually landed on a mountain. And up this mountain, God promised Noah that he would never flood the entire earth ever again. And the sign of this promise was the rainbow. But this week I'm going to focus on the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus leads Peter, James and John up a mountain. So as they go up this mountain, we can expect there to be something spectacular happen up this mountain.
About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendour, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfilment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud, saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen.
Although we don't know the exact location of where the Transfiguration took place, we are told in the book of Matthew that it was on a high mountain. So Jesus leads Peter, James and John, 3 of his disciples, up a high mountain to pray. As they climb this mountain, Peter, James and John are probably expecting something miraculous to happen. They have specifically been chosen to join Jesus up this mountain. They've been led away from the crowds to a desolate place where there's no onlookers watching them. As we read on in the book of Luke, we learn that something amazing does indeed happen. Jesus' clothes become a dazzling white, and 2 men, Elijah and Moses, appear. Elijah and Moses were both key characters in the Old Testament. I imagine Peter, James and John have grown up hearing the incredible stories of how Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and parted the Red Seas, and how Elijah had so much faith in God that he knew God would be able to light the damp wood when Elijah was asked to prove that his God was the one true God. For Peter, James and John, meeting Moses and Elijah would be a bit like meeting your favourite celebrity. So you can imagine how surprised they were to see them up this mountaintop talking to Jesus. But the more astonishing thing is that Moses and Elijah have both been dead for thousands of years. So how can they be there on this mountaintop talking to Jesus? However, rather than hearing how Peter, James and John reacted to this astonishing sight, we read that upon reaching the top of the mountain, they had fallen asleep. Maybe it was a difficult mountain to climb and they were exhausted. Maybe they had tried to pray with Jesus, but they couldn't keep themselves awake. Or maybe they had just gotten bored of waiting for something to happen. We don't know how long they had been up this mountain praying before the Transfiguration happened. but I imagine that if they had fallen asleep, they must have been waiting for several hours. Maybe after praying for an hour or two, they decided that nothing was going to happen and they gave up. What if they had walked back down the mountain instead of just falling asleep? They would have missed out on what Jesus wanted to show them. He was trying to show them that he truly was the Son of God. If you were there on that mountaintop, how long would you wait? In our lives at the moment, what have we missed out on because we got bored of waiting?
Several years ago, there was an experiment called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment, where basically they got young children and sat them in a room with a single marshmallow in front of them. And they told the children that you could either have the marshmallow right away, or you can wait until they get back and you get 2 marshmallows. Now, lots of the children were in pairs. They had a younger sibling and an older sibling. And the older sibling would be telling the younger sibling, oh, wait until they get back, then you get 2 marshmallows and that's better. But the younger sibling, of course, doesn't understand the concept of waiting, so they eat their marshmallow right away. And the older child, before long, even though they said they'd wait, they start sort of picking up the marshmallow and they start just licking a tiny little bit, and then they take the tiniest little bite, and then before long, the marshmallow's gone. And as adults, I think we can be a bit like that too. We can decide to wait for something, but actually realise that the wait's longer than we thought it would be, and we give in. So we're going to do our own version of the marshmallow experiment. We don't have marshmallows, unfortunately, but we do have jelly babies. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a jelly baby and we're going to place it on the end of our tongue and hold it there and see how long we can wait with it on the end of our tongue. And if you have something yummy, maybe you have chocolates or a biscuit or even sweets yourself, then you can play along at home and tell us how long you lasted.
Sing from heaven. From heaven you can hear. I know you draw near as I worship. Held within your love, the wind and waves will come. I will stay here. I lift my hands to heaven, in my heart surrender. Tell my soul again, you are Lord of all. Though the seas are raging, you will speak and tame them. You are find my rest, you are in control. Through valleys I trust, your spirit is enough to keep me walking. You guide my every step, speak life to me again. Lord, I need you. And oh, I need you. I lift my hands to heaven, in my heart surrender. Tell my soul again, you are Lord.
In our lives at the moment, we're waiting for everything to go back to normal. We're waiting for schools to fully reopen in September. We're waiting for church services to be held in person again. I'm here sat in my office, which has become my school desk. This is where I do all of my schoolwork and I attend my live lessons. But the thing is that the wait isn't over yet, and we have to be patient in our waiting, and it's important that we don't give in and do things our way. We have to wait for God's timing. So now we're going to go back to the story of the Transfiguration and hear how Peter, James and John reacted to seeing Elijah and Moses there talking to Jesus. When Peter, James, and John did wake up to see that Jesus' clothes had become a dazzling white, and that two men, Elijah and Moses, were stood there talking to Jesus, Peter exclaimed with excitement, "I know, let's build 3 shelters, one each for Elijah, Moses, and Jesus." But a voice from heaven said, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Peter got distracted by the sight of Elijah and Moses and didn't see what Jesus was trying to tell them. God had to remind Peter to listen to Jesus. In our waiting, are we listening out for what God might be trying to tell us, or are we rushing about trying to get our lives back to normal? What we should be doing in our waiting is taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, focusing on what God's plan is for you. I often find that by taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, I can see how God has shaped my life to be the person I am today. It may seem like you are taking steps backward rather than forward in your life at the moment, but just know God is in control, and you won't necessarily reach the finish line the way that you imagined you would when you started.
So challenge yourself to take some time each day this week, even if it's just for a few minutes, to just sit and be quiet, take a break from your life, and sit and listen to what God might be wanting to tell you. And don't let yourself just say, "Oh, I'll just do it later." Make it a priority, make it part of your daily routine, like brushing your teeth or having a shower. So as I've already said, mountains in the Bible are significant. This is because when you think about it, the different events that happen up mountains, there's often a strong presence of God. For example, when Moses goes up the mountain to meet with God, it's clear that there's a presence of God there because there's the large clouds of smoke. And when Noah landed the ark, God made that promise with him that he wouldn't flood the earth again. But what about events that don't happen up mountains? Well, just before Jesus is betrayed, he goes to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane isn't up a mountain, it's actually at the foot of the Mount of Olives. This means that as Jesus prays there, he's quite possibly feeling distant from God and quite isolated and alone, which I'm sure we can all relate to in the current circumstance. And in this garden, Jesus pleads with God that he would end his suffering because he's scared. He knows what's ahead of him. He doesn't want to die on this cross. And so he's at his most vulnerable. And just like with the Transfiguration, he has brought his 3 friends with him, Peter, James, and John. But he tells Peter, James, and John to pray that they won't give up into temptation. But that's exactly what they do. They fall asleep. And Jesus wakes them up and tells them, don't fall asleep, stay awake, keep praying. But they continue to fall asleep over and over again until Jesus is eventually betrayed. And the thing is that by falling asleep, Peter, James, and John weren't there for Jesus when he needed them most. Jesus was at his most vulnerable here. He felt isolated, alone, probably distant from God because he's praying to God, saying, "Please don't let me suffer." But of course, nothing happens. He still has to suffer. And I imagine that when Peter, James, and John look back on this event after it happened, they probably regret falling asleep and giving in to that temptation of not waiting, because at the end of the day, they weren't there for their friend. And this story shows the importance of waiting and not doing things our own way. And we can apply it to our own lives because God has a plan for us all, and some parts of that plan might not happen when we expect them to. But the thing to bear in mind is that when it comes to timing, God's timing is always best. He knows what's going to happen in the future. And so we can't think that our timing is better than his because we don't know what's going to happen.
After Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, we see him one last time on the Mount of Olives near the Garden of Gethsemane, and he gives his disciples one last instruction and then ascends into heaven. Jesus' final words to his disciples are,
Be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Especially when we're waiting, it can feel like God has forgotten about us, but He hasn't. God is always with us, and He never stops working in our lives. And by taking a step back and being patient, we will see Him at work in our lives, and we will begin to see the plans He has for us. So during this time of waiting for life to go back to normal, let's focus on the fact that God hasn't abandoned us. He has a plan for us, and we have to trust Him and trust that His timing is the perfect timing. So as we go back into a time of worship, take some time to focus all of your attention onto God.